Hello, everyone, to the September presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Ben Woodbury with the Friends of History and will be your host today. As always, let me start with a few administrative details before today's presentation. Hello, everyone. A reminder, the September presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. First Wednesday online lectures are now available on our new Friends of History webpage. friendsofhistorynm.org. Just click on the lecture series link at the top of the page. Our monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History with the support of the New Mexico History Museum. We do, however, accept and encourage donations. These funds will go directly to support the lecture series and, more importantly, all History Museum programs and exhibits. Should you wish to make a donation, just go to our website and click on the Donate button at the top of the page. Looking toward our October presentation, our speaker will be Robert L. Studi, Ph.D., and he will discuss on October 6th, Ghost Towns of the Southwest. If you wish to be on our mailing list to learn more about this lecture and all upcoming lectures, you can sign up on our webpage or email us at the address cited in the chat below. And now for today's lecture. Our speaker is Jeffrey P. Shepard, Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at the University of Texas in El Paso. He earned his Ph.D. at Arizona State University and joined UTEP in 2002. His first book, published in 2009 with the University of Arizona Press, is titled We Are an Indian Nation, A History of the Hualapai People. His second book, published with the University of Massachusetts Press in 2019, is Guadalupe Mountains National Park, An Environmental History of the Southwest Borderlands. Dr. Shepard is presently working on several additional projects, a manuscript focusing on historical memory and public commemoration tied to the Washita Battlefield National Historic Site in Oklahoma, and ongoing research into Apache history, particularly the 1852 Treaty, which will be discussed today. He's received grants, contracts, and awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Newberry Library, the American Historical Association, and the National Park Service. Today's presentation focuses on the Apache Treaty of 1852, which is the only treaty negotiated solely with Apaches and ratified by Congress and the President. Sandwiched between the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the U.S.-Mexico War in 1848, and the Mesilla Treaty of 1853, which finalized the Gadsden Purchase from Mexico, this treaty with the Apaches illuminates the complex history of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Long overlooked, this treaty remains a vital document acknowledging Apache claims to land and their unique political and legal relationship with the United States. Following the presentation, Jeff will answer any questions you may have. Your questions and comments can be posted at any time on the YouTube or Facebook chat rooms, both during and after the presentation. Upon completion of today's event, the entire presentation will be posted on the Friends of History webpage, as well as on the History Museum's YouTube and Facebook pages. So now, let us welcome Jeff Shepard.
So, good afternoon or good morning. My name is Jeff Shepard, Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History. I'm very happy to be here to speak about the Apache Treaty of 1852. Before I get started, I really would like to thank the museum in New Mexico history, particularly Billy Garrett and Ben Woodard, for inviting me to do this talk. I also want to thank a few of the friends and colleagues that have helped me learn about this treaty and Apache history in general. Doctors Margot Tamez, Maurice Crandall, Matt Babcock, Billy Kaiser, and also the Chittenden Ende leader, Manny Sanchez. All of them have been very generous with their time and knowledge. Also, since I'm on Apache land, I hope to share this story of this treaty and provide a little bit of an insight into an overlooked yet important aspect of borderlands history. So this presentation explores the only ratified treaty between the Apache and the United States. Signed in 1852, sandwiched between the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Mesilla Treaty, also known as the Gadsden Purchase, scholars have generally overlooked the nuances and implications of this treaty. In an attempt to correct that, I want to address a few basic issues. First, I discuss some Apache diplomatic and political relationships with Spain and Mexico in the years before the 1852 treaty that undoubtedly shaped Apache's decision to sign the treaty in 1852. Second, I look at the context of the treaty, which included cycles of peace and violence and tensions between Mexican communities, the Apache, and the New Mexico territorial government. Third, I want to discuss the treaty itself, some of its main elements, articles, and implications. And then finally, I want to explore a little bit about what the Apache Treaty means for Apaches today. Since treaties frequently focus on the resolution of conflict between groups, it's important to consider the political traditions and structures of the Apache to understand how these agreements might have worked. When leaders signed these treaties, who did they represent and who were they responsible for? Which bands enjoyed the fruits of the agreements? One of the most common themes in borderlands history is the difference between the decentralized political structure of the Apache and the hierarchical structures of Spain, Mexico, and the US. Non-Apache officials repeatedly complained about their ability to negotiate with, quote, all Apaches. And Apaches, of course, viewed this a little bit differently. Their decentralized structure, which was functional and intentional, gave them great flexibility of movement and decision-making in the borderlands. During the decades before the treaty, Apache relations with surrounding communities were very complicated. Localized bands crafted relationships, which included peace agreements, captive taking and trading, and in some cases, warfare. They exhibited restraint, sometimes with outsiders, and adhered to terms of an agreement, while other times bands knew very little bit of agreements made with other Apaches. Sometimes they retaliated against others, and sometimes they showed mercy when a group broke an agreement. Some scholars argue that Spanish and Mexican and later U.S. demographic pressure and warfare altered Apache leadership traditions to magnify the importance of a, quote, warrior culture to the detriment of their traditions of peace and diplomacy. To glimpse what the treaty might have meant to the Ende, which is their name for themselves, we must briefly recognize patterns of conflict and accommodation during the previous eras. Spain made numerous treaties with indigenous communities, and this relatively common practice structured Apache expectations that the U.S. would follow suit. Spanish and Mexican policies towards the Apache ranged from extermination to the very novel establecimientos de paz, with much interaction ranging in between those extremes. And according to historian Matt Babcock, there are very intriguing parallels between the Indian policies of Spain, Mexico, and the U.S., and these similarities probably helped Apaches consider a treaty with the U.S. in 1852. Looking at treaty making from the perspective of the Apache is complicated, but we see some commonalities from the preceding eras that shed light on the 1852 treaty. Treaty making afforded Apaches a sense of security from Comanche war parties until, of course, Spain allied with the Comanches against the Apaches in the 1780s. Treaties allowed Apaches to peacefully enter Spanish towns to procure food and goods, and even track down lost or captive relatives. Some treaties opened the door for settlement and the peace establishments. Other times, treaties between one band and a Spanish official were part of a larger Apache diplomatic strategy to calm tensions in one region while they gained ground and influence in another. Contrary to the belief that Spain set all terms of treaty making, Apache leaders had significant influence in decision-making on how and when they signed some of these agreements. If those agreements didn't seem good to them, they simply refused to sign them. This confidence surely extended over the generations and influenced Apache decisions to sign a treaty in 1852. After the independence movements of the early 1800s, treaty making changed as the collapse of Spain and the emergence of the Mexican Republic and led to war, debt, and turmoil. The inability of Spain and later Mexico to supply goods and protection to the Apaches frustrated many of them and made them less inclined to adhere to every aspect of said agreements. During the relatively brief era of Mexican rule, the Mexican government continued trying to sign treaties with the Apaches. Indeed, there are several treaties through the late 1830s up to the beginning of the U.S.-Mexico War. Many of these localized treaties were a function of a weak Mexican state, and they also reflected growing Apache power and confidence. The overall patterns during the era, however, which combine Apache and Comanche influence, also led to a series of raids and spikes in violence throughout the region. Roughly 8,000 Mexicans died in conflicts with Apaches between the 1820s and the 1840s, and approximately 100 settlements and towns were destroyed, leading to approximately 6,000 non-Indians becoming refugees. This violence extended throughout the borderlands and constituted what historian Brian DeLay termed the War of 1,000 Deserts, which is also the title of his book. Both the war and the treaty between the U.S. and Mexico have been covered by scholars, but I want to summarize their relevance for Apaches in New Mexico within the context of this massive transfer of land and power. Though the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said very little explicitly about Apaches, it implied a lot about them. Article 11 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is posted here, required the U.S. to stop raiding of Indians into Mexico. It criminalized the trafficking of Mexicans into the U.S., and it also outlawed the purchase of those Mexican captives in the U.S. This struck at the core of the centuries-old economy of taking and trading captives throughout the borderlands. The inclusion of Article 11 in the treaty also helped persuade the Mexican Congress to approve the treaty, but the article also concerned members of the U.S. Congress, particularly many Southerners and those in Texas, who were very doubtful that the U.S. was going to be able to stop that movement into Mexico. In fact, the expectations that the U.S. would stop Apache raids into Mexico actually increased diplomatic tensions between the U.S. and Mexico, between Mexicans and U.S. troops, and also between Hispanos that were now in the United States because they expected the military to protect them. As historian William Kaiser notes, quote, as a direct impetus for the intercultural clashes and power struggles, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo became one of the earliest premeditators of conflict between the U.S. government and the various Apache bands. So essentially, anti-Apache policies emerged on both sides of the border after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. U.S. militarization included the construction of forts to enforce Article 11 and to launch raids throughout Indian country. As settler colonists participated in the gold rush and thus penetrated native lands, they destabilized diplomatic relationships between Apaches and surrounding communities. Anglo and Hispano vigilante groups hunted Indians with greater frequency. The state of Chihuahua passed legislation approving the purchase of Apache prisoners and scalps and allowed the governor's office to make contracts known as contratos de sangre with groups to make war against Apaches. In particular, the notorious Ley Quinto, or the Fifth Law, created a pay rate for native scalps. From the perspective of Mexican officials, the loss of their northern territory and the treaty with the U.S. posed tremendous burdens on them, particularly because Apaches continued assaulting their communities. In short, the U.S. could not enforce Article 11 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Destruction of Mexican towns alarmed so many Mexican officials, such as Alejo Garcia Conde of Chihuahua, who in 1850 pointed to ongoing Apache raids in his state. Similarly, Mexican envoy Juan N. Almonte, writing to Secretary of State William Marcy, observed that, quote, the greatest portion of the frontier of Mexico has been entirely laid waste by a series of incursions that have neither been prevented nor checked, although coming precisely within the pale of the category to which the stipulations of the 11th article ought to be applied. As U.S. and Mexico argued over Article 11, Apaches expected the U.S. military to treat them with respect, provide them with rations and supplies, and seek permission to move through their traditional homelands. To most Apaches, perhaps, the shift from one colonial power to another, particularly one that had conquered their former enemies, could have elicited a degree of respect. One can imagine, then, that Apaches felt confident that they held an upper hand in ensuing negotiations with the United States. So in 1852, the year in which the U.S. signed this particular treaty with the Apaches, tensions remained high, and the U.S. military enjoyed very little leverage over Apache bands in the area. Charles Overman, special agent for Apaches in Socorro, New Mexico, noted that, quote, the Jornada del Muerto is travailing with fear and trembling, end quote, and that Apache power hampered all communication between El Paso and Santa Fe. Even John Bartlett of the U.S.-Mexico Boundary Commission reported to the governor of Texas that El Paso was, quote, utterly defenseless and surrounded by bands of Apaches. That said, there are some possible reasons why Apaches met with U.S. officials in 1852. They may have wanted some guidance on how to deal with westward migrants en route to gold fields throughout the West. Apaches also may have actually sought an ally in the U.S. in their wars against Mexico. Some of the more far-sighted leaders, such as Mangas Coloradas, may have viewed treaty negotiations within the context of their long-standing diplomatic experience with Spain and Mexico. Perhaps with a degree of skepticism about the new U.S. military, Mangas may have also wanted a peremptory treaty to confirm Apache sovereignty, set ensuing terms of engagement, ensure a system of communication, and possibly to win rations, tools, and other items. So now I want to shift into a little bit more focused discussion of the actual treaty of 1852 with the Apache. You might not be surprised that historians like context, so we have to go back a little bit and have a discussion of the origins of things like this particular treaty. So during the spring of 1852, overtures of peace began between some Apaches and the New Mexico Territorial government. In May 1852, Cuchillo Negro, leader of a significant number of Gila Apache around present-day Silver City, reached out to Major Howe, commander of the newly created Fort Webster, to discuss peace. Howe told him he could not make peace when the military was simultaneously at war with other Apaches. So Cuchillo Negro sent warriors to find other leaders, particularly the very prominent Mangas Coloradas. Howe sent word to Santa Fe, informing Governor Calhoun of the possible peace agreement. Unfortunately, perhaps, Governor Calhoun died in early May while traveling back east, and President Fillmore would not appoint his successor, William Clark Lane, until late July. Lane actually didn't arrive into New Mexico Territory until September, leaving administration of the territory quite uncertain. Colonel Sumner, the military commander of the district, immediately appointed himself governor, claiming an alleged plot among Mexican citizens to take over the territory. Citing this alleged unrest, Sumner became governor and dictated policy towards the native inhabitants. It was in this confusing situation that the only ratified treaty between the U.S. and Apaches was signed in New Mexico Territory. So rather than make the trip to the Mogollon Mountains or other Apache homelands to the south, the group met in Acoma Pueblo in early July. And so you can see that here with the red lines. It's not entirely clear why they met in Acoma, the homeland of the Puebloan people, but it's important to consider that this was also roughly the area of where the Navajo and some of the northern Apache territories met. There's also an idea that Sumner did not want to march all the way south, so seeing it a little bit more convenient to meet in Acoma. An alternative and a very intriguing view is that Mangas Coloradas had requested Acoma as a meeting place because he felt much safer there. He may have been a little bit concerned about going into Santa Fe, where Mexicans harbored tremendous animosity towards Apaches, and also where there was probably a contingent of U.S. military. So this particular view demonstrates Apache agency in choosing Acoma as a place to sign the treaty. This also led to some historians referring to this as the Acoma Treaty. While it's hard to confirm the reasons for meeting there, the signing of the treaty was a critical moment in Apache diplomacy. The importance of Mangas Coloradas signing the treaty cannot be overstated. With his approval, the treaty would have, without his approval, it would have meant very little to most Apaches. So Superintendent John Grenier noted the leader's importance, saying, quote, Mangas is their chief captain and counselor and can speak for all his people and promises fair treatment to them. Upon entering Sumner's tent, Mangas allegedly told the colonel, Ken, the governor, you are the chief of the white men. I am the chief of the red men. Now let's talk and treat. In addition to Mangas Coloradas, there are several other leaders at the signing. Captains Huerta, Fuentes Azules, Blanconcito, Negrito, and Captain Simon. The treaty, which Congress and President Franklin Pierce ratified almost a year later in 1853, acknowledged that the chiefs were, and this is very important, acting, quote, on the part of the Apache Nation of Indians, situated and living within the boundary of the United States. This is important because it indicated that the treaty referred to all Apaches living in the United States. So the treaty consisted of 11 articles that collectively reflected the trends in early 1850s Indian policy and the unique relations between the U.S. and Indian nations after the U.S. war with Mexico. The first few articles stressed peace with the U.S. and acknowledged the U.S. as the sole power with whom Apaches would negotiate. But very importantly, Article 5, underlined here, stood out from most treaties during the decade because it required the Apaches to, quote, refrain from making any incursions within the territory of Mexico of a hostile or predatory character. This article clearly grew out of Article 11 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and it symbolized the desperation of the U.S. to manage cross-border movement of indigenous groups. So you can sort of read through this, and you see how urgent a message that they're sending to Apaches. But they're also sending this message, I would argue, to Mexico in their attempt to stop this movement. You can imagine that Article 5 was particularly hard for Mangas Coloradas, who, according to Sumner, reacted with great disbelief. Upon hearing the terms, the chief allegedly responded, quote, "Are we to stand by with our arms folded while our women and children are being murdered in cold blood, as they were the other day in Sonora? Are we not to have the privilege of protecting ourselves?" End quote. Mangas Coloradas had reason to be concerned because the international border was further to the south than it is today, and thus a considerable percentage was further to the north, and this meant that a considerable portion of Apache homelands were south of the boundary in Mexico. So crossing the international boundary into the U.S. gave them security from Mexican forces, but this article added punitive measures for engaging in their normal behaviors within Apache territory. Sometime later, Mangas Coloradas allegedly told a U.S. military official that Sumner had given him tacit approval to continue crossing the border, sort of in a wink-wink. Thus, Sumner's alleged flexibility on the article made Mangas agree to a treaty that he didn't really think actually enforced a change in Apache behaviors. Now, this is a little bit hard to verify, but other articles were a little bit more standard in terms of the language of treaties during the 1850s. So you can see here, Articles 7, 8, and that should say 9, in fact, sort of pertain to people moving, non-Indians moving through the territory. They also pertain to building military posts, agencies, and trading houses. Some of this may have been not entirely clear to all Apaches, particularly the point about building forts within Apache homelands. And then finally, Articles 10 and 11 stipulated that the U.S. would grant Native Americans, the Apaches, donations, presents, and implements. And it said that the discussions of a reservation would be delayed for some time into the future. So what do we make of this treaty here? So there's relatively few witnesses to the actual signing of this document. Agent Grenier wrote about the treaty in his official reports and correspondence, and also in testimony to Congress several years later. He viewed the treaty with great skepticism, even though he had signed on to it, and he doubted that Apaches would stop their raiding into Mexico. Quote, "The people of Sonora and Chihuahua have treated these Indians very badly, and I fear it will be almost impossible to prevent hostilities between them," end quote. But Grenier focused almost exclusively on Article 5 of the Apache Treaty, revealed the attempt by the U.S. to tie this Apache Treaty to Article 11 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. When Grenier testified to Congress, he also conveyed the sentiments of Mangas Coloradas about the tensions between Apaches and Mexico. Mangas referred to the scalp bounty and the actions of James Kirker, one of the most notorious scalp bounty hunters in the borderlands. And he, in particular, relayed an incident told to him by Mangas when a group of Apaches and Mexicans had become intoxicated, and Mexicans killed the Apaches with clubs. He also narrated another incident when Apaches were peacefully trading with Mexicans in a village, and the community used a cannon to kill those Apaches. Even the Santa Fe newspaper understood the enmity between the groups, and it predicted the actions of the Apaches after they signed the treaty. Quote, "So the probability is that when the Apaches, go home after signing the treaty, they will make an inroad upon the settlements of Sonora and Chihuahua, and our government cannot prevent them," end quote. So unlike the written records left behind some of the U.S. officials, it's definitely hard to ascertain the motives of Mangas Coloradas with this treaty. As the most prominent signatory, it is reasonable to think that he viewed the treaty in light of the previous agreement that he himself had made with Spain and Mexico. He and leaders before him negotiated with these countries, and he probably believed that the treaty represented an agreement between equals, that it implied a sense of goodwill, trust, and reciprocity. Most treaties do, in fact, contain some sort of recognition of the place and space in which Native people are living. So this in and of itself is important. He also would have expected most treaties to maintain peace, adjudicate on individuals, particularly non-Indians that broke that peace, and establish a flow of supplies and annuities. But it's also important to note that this treaty did not mention any cession of land. This did not require Apaches to give up land, and it did not include the boundaries of a reservation. So this is extremely important to consider. Another challenge facing historians trying to gauge the views of Apache signatories is simply determining which groups they represented. Mangas Coloradas represented numerous bands of Chiricahua, particularly Chickasaw groups in the western portions of New Mexico. Well, the western portions of present-day New Mexico. At the time, New Mexico included present-day Arizona. Cuentas Azules also represented a large percentage of Mescaleros, most likely those living in the vicinity of the Sacramento Mountains east of the Rio Grande. However, Cuchillo Negro did not sign, and he was a prominent leader in the West, and it's not clear why he did not. Other signatories came from an array of Apache subgroups, and they surely would have taken the terms of the treaty back to their people. So in the years following the signing of the treaty, we see great trauma and tragedy for the Apaches. First, the region experienced another pivotal event with the redrawing of the international boundary. The Treaty of Mesilla, the Gadsden Purchase, moved the border southward, and in the process pulled vast swaths of Apacheria into the United States and thus directly under jurisdiction of the U.S. military. It also emboldened more Mexican communities to demand the protection of the U.S. military and also to file depredation claims against the Apaches. The military itself increased its expeditions against Apaches almost everywhere and expanded and strengthened its string of forts. In particular, the construction of Fort Stanton in the heart of Mescalero country proceeded to change life for many Apaches. To complicate matters even worse, there were at least 2 unratified treaties between Apache groups in New Mexico in years following the ratified 1852 treaty. One treaty signed in 1855, mainly with Mimbres Apaches, did, in fact, cede land and commit the signatories to more sedentary practices of farming. This one had the approval of Delgadito, Itan, Cuchillo Negro, and a dozen other leaders, and it contained, as I mentioned, explicit references to reservation boundaries and the attempt to farm, as well as the standard boilerplate language seen in many 1850 treaties. Similarly, that summer, Mescalero leaders signed a treaty with Governor Meriwether, wherein they agreed to forfeit a significant portion of their territory, but this came immediately after a large and extremely violent military campaign in their borderlands. So agreements like this raise some concern about the ability of Apaches to make reasonable decisions, essentially treaties made at the end of a gun or a bayonet. This treaty also went unratified, although the government expected the Mescaleros to abide by its stipulations. So that was extremely frustrating for those Native communities. Whether ratified or not, many Apaches found it difficult to abide by all these agreements as Hispanos and U.S. military harassed and surrounded them. Gila Apaches, led by Cuchillo Negro, who did not sign the 1852 treaty, continued raiding into Mexico. Similarly, in September 1852, Delgadito raided several ranches around Doña Ana. In early 1853, Tensions exploded in the Mimbres Valley as troops from Fort Webster attacked Chief Ponce in retaliation for allegedly stealing livestock from ranches in the area. During this attack, Chief Ponce was killed. Several years later, troops killed Nantan Cuchillo Negro after he signed that 1855 Mimbres Treaty, which I mentioned, in a strange series of events tied to the killing of Navajo Indian agent Henry L. Dodge, for which the military blamed Cuchillo Negro. So at the end of the decade, we also see U.S. troops coming upon a peaceful camp of Coyotero Apaches along the Gila River, and after indiscriminately opening fire upon them, killed 35 Apaches. And finally, in one of the most wanton acts of violence during the time, a civilian group known as the Mesilla Guard rode out of the village of Mesilla in 1852 and killed nearly 20 Apaches living peacefully near Fort Horn and Doña Ana. So now I want to wrap things up a little bit, but also to sort of widen the scope of the conversation here. After the U.S. war with Mexico, the U.S. gained control over tremendous territory that doubled the size of the still young nation. This act of conquest brought into the boundaries of the U.S. hundreds of powerful indigenous nations. This action precipitated a reassessment of U.S. policy, which relied on removal westward to areas such as Indian Territory, which were nominally beyond the U.S. body politic. With the conquest of the Mexican North and the resolution of the U.S.-Mexico and the U.S., quote, Canada boundaries, technically this was the British Empire, did not become, quote, Canada for decades later, the U.S. could no longer remove Indians to the west or otherwise beyond its own borders. Moreover, the gold rushes of the era resulted in massive demographic collapses in areas such as California and elsewhere. The demands of nascent capitalists, coupled with the traditions of unfree labor in New Mexico and chattel slavery in Texas, revealed many of the very difficult antebellum debates about the expansion of slavery in the West. Moreover, the permeable southern border exposed the weaknesses of the U.S. state and the considerable power of the Comanche and Apache. Thus, the treaties with the U.S. made with Native nations in the 1850s reflected the power dynamics of this highly volatile place and time. That many of these treaties were peace treaties rather than land cession treaties, in this case revealed that the Apache in 1852 did not give up their land. Again, this was a peace treaty, not a land cession treaty. So with all that said, the Apache Treaty of 1852 matters for us today. Indeed, it matters for the Apache in Arizona, New Mexico, and even Texas, as well as in Chihuahua. The text of the treaty noted, quote, the Apache Nation, and it didn't discriminate or differentiate between individual bands or groups. The signatories believed that the U.S. would adhere to their commitments and provide them with rations and supplies, protect them from outsiders, and respect their autonomy and their claims to their homelands. The treaty recognized them as prior and proper occupants of the land. Engaging in this treaty involved trust, reciprocity, and respect. And although some bands may have engaged in violent encounters with newcomers, international treaties don't evaporate because they're difficult to adhere to. Indeed, they help signatories behave properly. They provide protocols for interaction, and in the case of the Apache Treaty, help them live at peace and keep the integrity of their homelands. So again, this was not a land cession treaty. Apaches, quote, lost their land in ensuing decades of military conquest, the forcible concentration of their people later onto reservations, and then the removal to far-flung places such as Florida and Oklahoma. In short, the U.S. took their land without treaty and by force. Apaches did not agree to handing it over, in the midst of this violence, the concentration on reservations, or during the theft of their children as the U.S. forcibly took them to boarding schools. Those that escaped isolation on reservations either fled to Mexico or they hid in the shadows of the United States and were treated as if they were Mexican. In 2021, nearly 169 years after Apache leaders signed this treaty, it still remains relevant today. Indigenous protests over water and air pollution, land pollution, the construction of pipelines and mining pits, and other impacts have led many Apache community leaders to begin referring again to this treaty. They are reminded of the U.S. and its obligations, and in doing so, they're casting a bright light on an overlooked agreement. They're also pointing out that the Apaches never agreed to the taking of their land. It was once theirs, and it still remains today Apache homelands. So again, I want to thank you, and I'm looking forward to any questions or conversations that we have in the next few minutes. Thank you.
Jeff, I want to thank you very much. That was truly a rich and detailed, but most informative presentation. It complements so well. Your shout outs to Billy Kaiser and to Matt Babcock mean a lot to us, as we've been privileged to have them speak for us over the last 2 years as part of this ongoing series of discussions on the borderlands. So we'd like to provide the opportunity for our listeners to ask questions. As I mentioned at the outset, any questions can be posted on the chat rooms of either the YouTube or Facebook pages which you are viewing, and hopefully folks have been doing so while the talk has been progressing. I'll do a shout out to my support team, see if there's been any questions at this point.
Yes, Ben, there is a question in the chat.
Would you like me to try to address that first question?
Yeah, can you see that? It's
Yes.
This is the one, it's actually 2 questions. The
They're
first
very good
is,
questions.
Hmm?
They're very good questions.
Oh, good. Well, I'll let you go.
So the first question, and thank you again, everybody, for the chance to talk about this treaty, and to offer, some speculative thoughts on its origins, the signing, meaning, and its legacy. So this is ongoing work. So I do appreciate you letting me have this chance to discuss it. So the question here, speaking further to how the treaty negotiations were interpreted and how reliable Apaches viewed the interpreters present. So this is a very well-informed question. The issue of interpreters across many treaties between the U.S. and Indian nations is important. Frequently, the text of the treaties was not necessarily presented in advance. In the case of the Apache Treaty, they would have been bilingual, definitely in Apache and Spanish. But from what I've seen, and again, I'm just at the beginning stages of this, I have not seen the names of interpreters there. So that's one sort of question that always arises, and that's one of the reasons why I was trying to look at the precedents of treaty making between some Apache groups, Mexico and Spain, because that would have helped the Apache understand, and drive and shape the negotiations. And so, although it's hard to determine what precise level of linguistic comprehension there is, my attempt at the context and sort of front loading was to try to demonstrate that Apaches were not new to this notion. And so that's my general response to that. But it's one of the many things that I want to continue looking at to sort of flesh out the actual time and space. That day, I think it's July 11th in 1852, what that moment was like, what those specific negotiations included. And then the second, again, very, very good observation, Article 9, recognizing Apache sovereignty and adjusting it to their territorial boundaries. Right, exactly. So after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, there was a series of treaties that the United States negotiated in the 1850s, somewhat rapid fire treaties, for the obvious purposes of articulating, U.S. sovereignty over an area. In California, for instance, there were, numerous treaties, I think nearly 20, that were then overturned and not ratified, largely due to the influence of the California state legislature. Well, I'm sorry, U.S. representatives in California that opposed those treaties for the obvious reasons of access to land in the gold rush and also Indian labor. There are also a series of treaties in the Pacific Northwest called the Isaac Treaties. And then there was Isaac Stevenson. And then there were a series of treaties up in the Northern Plains. And I'm a little bit more familiar with the treaties with the Blackfoot, Blackfeet. And so, on the one hand, they're recognizing a degree of territoriality. And then they're also saying that in the near future, in presumably a treaty, there would be some sort of stipulations about reservations, but that never happened. And so this is, one of the questions that I've been trying to pursue, is that there was no official negotiation. There was no official land cession. Apaches did not agree to ceding land and then have that agreement or treaty ratified by Congress. The other treaty in 1855 that in 1853, I think, that did mention land issues, those were not ratified. So, again, those are two excellent questions. I appreciate it. And I'm really trying to work through and think through a lot of these issues. Thank you.
Yes. So Chris, any others pop up or?
That's it at the moment.
Not at the moment.
Yeah.
I was wondering, Jeff, in terms of, you mentioned the challenges of the fact that the government of the territory of New Mexico was somewhat in flux, in the sense that you had Calhoun, who was there at the initial stages, passed away heading east. Then Colonel Sumner, a soon-to-be Civil War general, took over as de facto executive, as well as head of the military department. And all of this transpired before the arrival in the fall, September, I think you said, of the new governor. With that, could you offer any elaboration on those and perhaps the influence of those personalities in terms of the process?
Well, no, that's another great question. There was a good deal of confusion during this time period in the early 20s and the years immediately after the treaty about who was in charge, essentially. There was supposed to be this bloodless conquest of New Kearny left and went south, left some people in charge, Then very, very quickly, there was the Taoist Rebellion. There was, fighting back. Then, the establishment of essentially a military territorial government. There were questions about who was in charge of, quote, Indian affairs. Was it the military? Was it the territorial governor? Also, the very young Department of Interior, most recently created a few years before that. And so in essence, you have all these different groups jockeying for power, and you start to see the decades long, fighting between the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and the U.S. military. Eventually Christian groups over who has charge of these things. And then, of course, you've got longstanding, quote, Mexican American. That's a somewhat difficult term to actually use. Mexican communities that stayed inside the United States after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and didn't go south back into Mexico. And they're making claims based on traditions of self-defense and community defense. And so then this leads us to these personalities. Sumner was extremely bullheaded, authoritarian streak. Some of the territorial governors were not interested really in being there. They saw it as sort of a punishment to serve in this territory, which many of them considered a backwater. And they tolerated it in part because they saw it as a painful step upward in their political careers. And then lastly, another sort of context for this is that there were times when some of the military, the commanders and some of the captains and such, were just saying we should let the territory go back to Hispanos and Native people. We should pull the civilian government out. We should pull the military out. It's a waste of time and money. So it's a very interesting time period. I was trained in 20th century US history and 20th century Native history, but I've really been drawn to this time period, particularly along the US-Mexico border, for these questions of authority, who has, the ability to shape events. And so it's not just individual personalities. And again, like I said, many of these guys didn't like each other. So it was a very complicated, contentious sort of time period. And it also reveals how sort of the US, quote, the US government or the US state was at times very fractured. And, we talk about politics today, but I think politics in antebellum US were particularly fractured, if not venomous. So that's a very good question. And all of that speaks to, who is quote in charge of US Apache relations.
Right. And of course, there was the assumptions about how Apache leadership, which of course, and not just Apache, but other Native American tribal leadership.
Sure. And you toss in the territorial boundary disputes with Texas. There were disputes between Sonora and Chihuahua, over Apaches. There were disputes between Texas and New Mexico. Military launching raids against Apaches that Indian agents like Michael Steck opposed. So it's a very, complicated set of issues.
Looks like Billy Kaiser came, Billy Garrett came up, and I don't see the question. Do you have that, Chris?
Oh, it just
Oh,
came
here we
up
go.
Yes, it just came up in the chat.
So has the 1852 treaty been used in any recent court cases? That's an excellent question. There's a very good report by, I think his name is John Walsh, and it's sort of a brief that looks at the influence or the relevance of the treaty, particularly for Western Apache. And I've talked with a few people about this, and it's come up in a few court cases, but not very many. It comes out very briefly in the Indian Claims Commission case that looked at Apache, Isleta, Tigua, and particularly Lapon and Mescalero land claims. And the ICC ran from 1946 to about the late 1960s, early 70s. But that's one of the reasons why I wanted to investigate this, is that I feel that these treaties are extremely important. Just because it's 169 years old doesn't mean it's irrelevant. Our Constitution and Bill of Rights are older than that. And so I think that, examining the treaty, what happened to it, and why it was, I termed it one time, quote, lost, just in sort of a polemical manner, that we need to revitalize these discussions. And in particular, there's a land dispute, a land use dispute in southeastern Arizona. And some of them, there was one over the observatory, I think it's Mount Graham, and a couple others that, require us to consider the contemporary relevance. There's one more question here. Did the treaty have any influence when the reservation was established at Ojo Caliente for the Chiricahua Apache since Mangas Coloradas signed it? Again, an excellent question. I think that was a little bit more, that specific with the Ojo Caliente, a little bit more tied to the 1853 unratified treaty. I'm pretty sure, but I'm not entirely positive. I've talked a lot about this with Chi'ene Ende leader Manny Sanchez, and that maybe Manny out there, I don't know. But this, again, these unratified treaties, they're very frustrating because Apaches thought that they became, quote, the law of the land, and Apaches tried to adhere to them, and then expected the U.S. to adhere to them. And one of the questions is, did Apaches ever find out that Congress, the Senate, and the president at the time never ratified those treaties? And so this really leads to some frustrating sort of situations with questions of land use, territoriality, and power.
Yes. Well, Jeff, I really want to thank you. It's been most informative throughout, and I know we look forward to seeing more of your analysis as the opportunities present themselves in the various forum available to you. And I wish you well and help to be part of this kind of broad series of ongoing lectures, periodic lectures that we have on the borderlands.
Great, and thank you again for inviting me.
Our pleasure. For our audience, again, I want to point out a couple of things. I mentioned, of course, next month's lecture, Bob Spoody on ghost towns in the Southwest. I now can report that Tom Chavez, the former director of the New Mexico History Museum, will be speaking on the kind of multicultural impacts of the Santa Fe Trail. This will be in November, and will be a lead up, hopefully, to the bicentennial celebrations here in Santa Fe and in Las Vegas, for that bicentennial on the weekend of 12 to 14 September with that. And finally, happy to announce that the Dominguez Escalante exhibit will be opening officially on Friday in the Palace of Governors. And so it's been a long-awaited exhibit, and we're looking forward to it, building off of a photographic tour that was done back earlier in around 2010, 2012. So we look forward to that. Plus, with that, wanted to be sure that you were aware of it. That's the Dominguez Escalante exhibit. So for now, thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you again in the ensuing months.